So thank you for signing on for this presentation, College Search in the Time of COVID. I know you may have a lot of questions. It is, and unfortunately, there still is a lot of uncertainty out there. So we're going to go through, and actually before I give you an overview of the presentation, I just want to introduce myself. I'm James Maroney. I'm the founder of First Choice College. So I founded First Choice College in 1999. So for over 20 years, I've been working with high school students and families on all aspects of the college search process. So we've worked with thousands of students and toured hundreds of colleges. In addition, I am on the Legislative Advisory Committee for the New England Board of Higher Education, and I'm on the State of Connecticut's Higher Education and Employment Advancement Committee as well. And I did serve on a committee that helped to rewrite the Connecticut, what is now called the Roberta Willis Scholarship, as part of the Strategic Planning Commission. And I am a 1992 graduate of Jonathan Law High School in Milford, and then from there I went to Yale. So I'm a 1996 graduate of Yale University. So, but tonight we're going to go through the presentation, and what I would say is if you have questions, please stop me whenever you have the question. If you're like me, you'll forget the question before we get to the end of the presentation. So you can either enter it in the chat or you can just ask, unmute yourself and ask the question. So first thing we're going to go through is which colleges have gone test optional. And a lot of people are wondering, do we even need to take the test anymore? Another question, what do you do since you can't visit colleges? How do you show demonstrated interest in colleges? And a lot of people may not be familiar with demonstrated interest, but demonstrated interest is actually, at some private colleges, they rank that as one of the top 6 factors in making their decision if they're going to accept a student or not. And so, for many of those colleges, it's actually as important or more important than letters of recommendation. And so demonstrated interest is, have you been on our campus for a tour? Have you visited, an information session? Have you interviewed? Have you, if you play a sport, have you contacted a coach? There are a number of different ways that you can show demonstrated interest in a college. And we're going to talk about that because a lot of them you would usually do in person. So what do we do now when the campuses are closed? What will college look like in the fall of 2020? And here, we're in the end of April, almost in May, and we really don't know yet. And a lot of colleges may not make the decision until the summer. And so, for high school seniors, it could be a little unsettling since typically May 1 was the decision date. Many colleges have extended that until June 1 for this year because of the uncertainty. Talk a little bit about yield and admit rates, and then talk about college finances. And actually, when we talk about the financial implications of this pandemic, there are really 2. One is on individual families. Colleges use what they call prior year when determining your EFC. EFC is expected family contribution. And so if you have a high school junior who's going to be graduating in 2021, they would be using the, and so you would be going to college in the fall of 2021, they would be using the 2019 tax year. For many people, 2020 is going to look very different than 2019 did. However, when they're determining your need, they'll be looking at that 2019. And so we'll talk a little bit about that, but there are also a lot of financial implications for the colleges themselves. How do you, and especially if you're looking at some of the smaller liberal arts colleges, there have been some that have closed over the last couple years. I was at a meeting where they had thought in one area it was going to be 1 in 4 small colleges may end up closing. And so how do you assess the financial health of a college or university? So talking about the test optional colleges. So a lot of colleges have announced that they are going test optional. And I say a lot, there are probably 40 to 50. And, at the end of this presentation, we'll make this PowerPoint available for you. And we do have a link to a list. We have a Google Sheet we've put together. And the reason we're using that is that we can continue to update it as we hear new information. I spoke with a representative at UConn, and they haven't decided yet. I think it's about 3 to 4 weeks before UConn makes a decision whether they're going test optional for next year. And I think if they do, it would likely be for a one year. But we would have to see. Cornell was the first Ivy League, and just the other day they announced that they will be test optional. In the article describing it, they're saying if you submit scores, they're looking at them. And they made it pretty clear that they only intend on doing this for 1 year to go test optional. And so a number of the colleges that have been announced are just for 1 year. There are a few that are for 3 years. And then, of course, there have been a lot of colleges over the last several years that have gone test optional, but for the most part, they've been smaller liberal arts colleges that really can look holistically at an application. There haven't been as many large state schools or larger private universities. Yale and others, as of now, are still going to require either the SAT or ACT, but they've gone Harvard and Yale, whereas it used to be recommended that you submitted the subject tests. They're now optional to submit the subject tests. So, but they, as of now, they are still requiring the SAT or ACT. So for college athletes, you need to go through the NCAA clearinghouse in order to be academically eligible. And if you're going to play either Division I or Division II sports, you need to submit test scores as part of your eligibility. They are waiving that for seniors who are going in for next fall because they've missed a lot of opportunities to get for a last chance at improving their score before school starts. But as of now, it is still a requirement for the class of 2021. So again, if you're a junior now, or let's say if you're class of 2021, that is a reason why you would want to take the test if you're planning on playing sports. Fairtest.org lists all of the test optional colleges, and you can go through. And again, there are some students who don't test well. And so, if you think that's going to be a barrier, you can look for some colleges that do not require. They don't break it out there by colleges that have just gone test optional for 1 year or just as a result of the pandemic. One of the things to keep in mind is that test optional does not mean test blind. And so what do I mean? And so test optional means that you can submit the scores if you have them. But if you submit them, they are going to look at them. There's only really one college that I know of, and there may be some more now, but that is truly test blind, and that was Hampshire College in Massachusetts. But most colleges, if you submit them, they will look at the test scores. They do report out average test scores, even if they're test optional. And many colleges do use the test scores when it comes to giving out their merit scholarships or the academic scholarships. So I jumped a little ahead there, but again, test optional is not necessarily test blind. So again, we'll put this up afterwards. Here's a link to the list of colleges that have gone test optional. And actually we could just go through this for a second into the list and just look at some of the schools. Actually, you know what, because it is loading a little slowly, you can look at that after. And if you have any questions, again, you can email me after or stop me at any time. There were a few articles recently, again, New York Times has had an article about some of the schools inside higher ed. And then this is a link to the NCAA decision, which again, just came out recently. So next, what do you do when you can't visit a college? And one of the things, some of these changes that have happened to colleges may not be permanent, but one that they do think may be more of a permanent change is moving admission online. And so having more of the virtual tours, which of course they've had, but what they've done is a lot more of the information sessions are online. So, again, you can go for a virtual tour, and they are often doing Zoom or other video conferences for information sessions. And again, because of that demonstrated interest, you want to make sure if they have anything and any online opportunity that you sign in so you know that they're tracking, and that goes in your file. So again, with demonstrated interest, they look at all of the touches you make with the school. The more touches you make or the more times you reach out to them, the more serious of an applicant they think you are. And it's not going to get you in somewhere where you don't belong. But one thing to remember is with thousands of applications at these schools, Yale over 30,000 applications, they typically accept around 2,100 students. It may have been a little higher this year, but there are, things are equal for a vast number. So of the over 30,000, over 20,000 could probably comfortably do the work there. And so what's going to set you apart? And what are those little things that are in your control as you get near the end of the process? And especially you're getting down near the end of your junior year or into your senior year, you can't change your previous 3 years' grades, right? But you can control the demonstrated interest. You can make sure you do a good application, you interview, and you write a great essay. So what are other ways of showing demonstrated interest in, interviewing with the school, those information sessions, in interviews, make sure that you have questions. And there are different types of interviews. A lot of colleges do alumni interviews. And so you would interview with an alumni in your area. Again, a lot of these are things that as they move admissions more online may change. They may not be doing as many of the alumni interviews in person. You used to meet, either sometimes at an alumni's home or at a coffee shop. A lot of these will now be moving online. And so typically alumni interviews are evaluative. So there are two types of interviews. There's informative and evaluative. And so there's always an evaluative component, but sometimes, if you're going for an informational interview, they're not going to ask you as many hard questions, but it's always a good idea for the student to have some questions, well thought out questions to ask the interviewer. So one thing that's a good idea, and this is probably, I heard this when I was at an information session at Johns Hopkins, and the admissions officer giving that information session, his advice was find out who's going to be reading your application and in some way create a connection with that person. And so it's a good idea to find out if the college recruits regionally, and in many schools, the way that the first read for an admissions application is for a regional director. So they have one person who would be in charge of your high school. So they get to know all the high schools in that area. So they know the strengths and weaknesses, and they have to learn, what's an A mean at one high school in one town versus another town. What are the most difficult courses? So, but ask if who is your regional admissions officer for your school, get the information to connect, and then email him or her, reach out and ask some questions. I think that's a good way to start to introduce yourself. You don't want to become a pain. You don't want to become that kid and email them every day and tell them what you had for breakfast or lunch or anything. But maybe I would say probably no more than once a month, to reach out, if that. But when things change, you may want to reach out and say, this happened, or, ask a question. And his example for the connection was, he was at an admissions fair recruiting students, and he met this girl, and it was at an admissions fair in New York City, and she told him, I'm going to write my essay about apple picking, and explain how it was a big a big tradition in her family. Every year they would go upstate to go apple picking. And he said, and then 2 months, fast forward a few months later, he got the essay that was about apple picking, and he's like, oh yeah, I remember that girl, and I remember really liking her. So if there's some way to create that connection. If you play a sport, whether or not you think you're going to play in college, it's a good idea to email the coach. Even to ask, how would I know if I could play? Are there open tryouts? Do you only take people on the team who have been recruited? But especially at the smaller schools, they're told to let the admissions office know whenever anyone reaches out. And again, it's another point of contact with the school. You may want to email the department head if you're intended major to ask some questions. And maybe if you're going into theater or music, email other advisors for the other activities you may be interested in to ask questions. And then this is a blog post we had done recently on demonstrated interest in the time of COVID, which gives you some tips, pretty much going over what we just talked about. I think the next thing that's on a lot of people's mind is, what will college look like in the fall of 2020? And right now, in April 28th of 2020, we still don't know. And there are up to 15 different options I've seen, and what they're advising most colleges is pretty much to narrow it down to three, the three likely, and then prepare for those three. There are a few colleges who have announced they will be back on campus next fall. Purdue University and the University of Missouri system have announced that they will be back on campus. Inside Higher Ed did a survey of, it was over 180 college presidents on a number of different topics, and about 47% of them expected to be back on campus next fall. And then there's about a good percentage who really still aren't sure. There are some colleges who are preparing for an online semester next year. Now, one thing is, especially at the private colleges, as you can imagine, most people who are listening to this will be paying a tuition. Many families are not happy with having to pay the full tuition as if they were going to the school for an online experience. And so that is an issue for some of the schools. UConn, like many of the colleges, is looking at three options, on campus, online, or a hybrid. And that's, I saw one advisor said it would be, it may be a toggle semester where they have to change, right? And so they have to switch, whether it's they start on campus and then they switch to online, or they start online and then they switch to going on campus. Some colleges are talking about delaying the opening. I've seen, I believe Georgetown Business School it's only 2 weeks back, but from August into the beginning of September, they're pushing it back. Some are talking about, what's the difference if we start in October versus we start in September, and then you push next year a little into the summer with the spring, push the spring semester a little later. Some colleges, BU and Stanford, are discussing not even having a semester in the fall and not starting until January of 2021. So this is a good article, which basically goes over some of the different options and plans that colleges are getting ready for the fall of 2020. And this article from the New York Times is discussing what college sports might or might not look like next fall. Is there a way to have sports next fall? And unfortunately, unless the majority of colleges are back on campus, for those athletes, they may miss the fall season, and they have to think of, what's the way to do it safely. And having 100,000 people in a stadium may not be safe yet next fall. So how has this affected the class of 2020? So again, with this year, we talk about the acceptance rate and the yield rate. And it's more of the selective colleges that don't deliver their final admissions decisions until April. A lot of them ended up accepting more students, a higher percentage this year, figuring they would get a lower yield. A yield is the percentage of people they accept to actually go there. So in order to get the class that they wanted, they figured they needed to accept some more students. Now, it's also possible with so much uncertainty that there will be more students from this year who get accepted who choose to take a gap year, to wait and not start their college experience until the fall of 2021. So we don't know how, in the end, how that will play out. And we're looking at a few factors. And even, from the students who have been accepted, they did a survey, 25% are thinking of changing the college. So there are students who maybe wanted to go further away who are rethinking that and now may want to go closer to home. But up to 20% think that they may not go to college next fall. And so what that may do is, for the next year, for the high school class of 2021 or the college class of 2025, you may have some less spots if they've already given them away and the people have deferred for a year. So that's something that, for the high school class of 2021, we'll want to keep an eye on how that plays out. Some colleges are actually reopening the admissions process. And so, we'll see 2 colleges I saw that have reopened the admissions, Furman in South Carolina. And again, the thought was that there were some students who were originally going to go far away and may want to stay closer to home. And they said they've already picked up 7 new students, or they had 7 really strong applicants. In the article, Franklin and Marshall in Pennsylvania has reopened. And it will be interesting to see. So in May of every year, the NACAC, National Association of College Admission Counselors, release a space available list, which is a list of colleges that haven't filled their incoming freshman class. That's going to be released on May 5th, and then they continually update that. So it will be interesting this year to see how many colleges still have space available. And then the other thing, that is part of that list is they list not only who has space available, but who still has financial aid to give. And so if you're thinking of changing, you may want to look at one of those schools if, your financial situation has changed and you're not sure if you're going to be able to afford your initial college. You may want to find some in there that are accepting students and have financial aid available. Or if the college you are accepted at says that they have space available and they have financial aid available, you may want to take that opportunity to reach out to them and ask for more aid, to present what they call an extenuating circumstance appeal. And we'll talk about that more, extenuating circumstance appeals, when we talk about the financial aspect of this pandemic. So another interesting factor, to add into this is that last year, NACAC changed its code of ethics. And one of the things that in the past, and it was because of a lawsuit, they said it was anti-competitive, but colleges were not allowed to try to recruit students away from other colleges or give certain incentives. And so what we're seeing now with colleges again, that perfect storm where, we were seeing a lot of students who are thinking of not going next fall. We don't know what's going to happen next fall. That colleges are giving way more incentives to students to try to entice them to come to their campus. So it may be locking the tuition for 4 years. If you register early, you get priority room or free parking. But they also are going to start looking at potentially at recruiting from transfer students from other colleges near them. And so it'll be interesting again to see how all of that plays out as well. And as if there weren't enough changes already, it's another change. So that's a really interesting article to read. And then the other link I have there is for that NACAC Space Available site. And again, that lists all of the colleges that still have space available in their freshman class and that, again, may have financial aid as well. So what are the financial implications? And so one of the things, when we talk about need-based financial aid, there's one formula for the whole country. And so there are there's one formula for the federal methodology, and so all colleges use the federal methodology. And so you submit your FAFSA form, and then the government comes up with a number called your EFC, your expected family contribution. And that goes off of what they call your prior year for income. And so for students graduating in 2021, the prior year would be 2019. So they're going to be looking at your 2019 income when you're applying. And so your 2020 may be very different. And so you would have to present what's called an extenuating circumstance appeal. And so what goes into that EFC, what your expected family contribution? There are 4 things that comprise your expected family contribution. And you have to reapply each year that the student is in college. And so the 4 things are parent contribution from income, parent contribution from assets, student contribution from income, student contribution from assets. And so, there's only one formula for the whole country. And so, I'm located in the Northeast, and so it's a more expensive place to live, but we don't get a big adjustment for that. So an income that may not seem to go very far here may go further somewhere else in the country. So it's important to know what the colleges are going to expect you to pay, and then what you can actually afford to pay. So if there's a big difference, between your 2020 and 2019, you'll have to present an extenuating circumstance appeal. And that's one thing that I read an article recently that Trinity College, they've had 3 times the typical extenuating circumstance appeals, 3 times what they normally get this year for the, for their incoming class, for those graduating seniors. And that's something that, each college is different. So UConn has a form and they only look at certain things, but you're more likely to get your need met when you're applying to colleges for the first time. And so you're going to want to make sure that you're applying to colleges in similar pairs. So even though colleges say they won't negotiate, if you apply to 2 similar schools and then you go back to them, and it's not a hard negotiation, but you can say, I'd much rather go, this is my son or daughter, and it's actually best if it comes from the student, him or herself. This is my first choice college. I would really like to go here, but for the extra $10,000 a year, $40,000, I can't justify that expense for my parents. Is there anything you can do to help make this decision easier? And then you can present at that time some of the factors that they would usually consider for an extenuating circumstance appeal. And so they usually will look at unreimbursed medical expenses. So if you had braces, if you're still paying off braces, or you have braces for another child. And, I had, for unreimbursed medical expenses, once I worked with a family where the mother was on the transplant list, and so had very high medical expenses that they had to deal with. It could be a cost of employment. And so when, when I applied for college, my father worked in Boston, but, we lived in Milford. So he spent much more commuting back and forth to work than people typically did. It could have been a drastic, a loss of a job. It could be a change in, marital status for the family, or unfortunately a death in the family. These are all reasons, you would present an extenuating circumstance appeal if there's a big difference. But one of the things that's important to know is you have again, I said before that, they're more likely to meet your need when you're going into school, but you want to spend a lot of time, ahead of time making a good plan. And so while you always want, and to me, the most important school on anyone's list is their safety school. And a safety school, and there are thousands of colleges across the country, and there are thousands that have virtually open admission that pretty much anyone can get in. But so it's a safety school isn't a school that you're going to get into, or where the student will be accepted there. A safety school is a school that the student will get accepted to, and that he or she would have a good experience there and be happy if they had to go to that school. And so once you lock that in, then for me, you take as many shots at the reaches, and then you want to have 2 or 3 target schools. But in addition to that admission safety, you want to have a financial safety. And I think now with the uncertainty, it's even more important that we have that financial safety school. And that's a school that, not that there's really, with the cost of college today, that there's a school that's going to be easy to pay for, but the school that'll cause the least amount of pain, of financial pain. And so it's not always your state school. And while a lot of people want to apply to the state schools, and I think that everyone should, I think that's especially in Connecticut, we have University of Connecticut, which is one of the top nationally, but we also have a lot of other great state schools here. But a lot of times the private colleges, you can get a deal at. And right now, the average tuition discount is about 50%, meaning that on average, a college only costs half of what the sticker price is. And so you want to do your research ahead of time to find out where they offer good merit scholarships. You want to apply to schools where the student is wanted, apply to schools in pairs. So in the end, you can, if you have a first choice, you want to apply to a school that's similar to that, so that you can help, perhaps compete those offers in the end. So yeah, you want to look for those schools that have strong merit aid programs. And so, one thing we do every year, we call 1,200 schools, approximately 1,200 schools across the country. So we have a database of college-based merit scholarships, so we can look by the students' SAT or ACT, GPA, and a number of other characteristics of the colleges, and find colleges where a student is eligible for scholarships. But other ways to know would be if you looked at the College Board, and then you looked at the schools, and they'll report what they call the 25-75 split for a college. So they'll give you 2 numbers. So let's say they'll say 1,100 to 1,300. So 1,100 would be the number that 25% of the accepted students scored below. 1,300 would be the number that 25% of the accepted students scored above. And so if you're above that, 75 number, then that's a school where you're likely to get some merit aid. And then if you're in between, that's a comfortable school for you. Again, there are other factors, right? The GPA, what you've done day in, day out for 4 years, is the most important. So some schools will report a 25-75 split for the GPA. A lot will only report the average GPA. And then the other issue with GPA is that a lot of high schools are on completely different systems. So some colleges have to recalculate, and typically they'll look at it, the recalculator, put it on an unweighted, but then they'll separately look at the strength of your curriculum. Some will look at it weighted. So another thing that, given the effects of this pandemic on college finances, and colleges are going to be losing millions of dollars even after the federal pandemic aid. Some colleges will be losing millions of dollars. It's critical to look at the financial strength of the school. And so probably one of the best ways to figure that out, well, not necessarily the best, but one of the easiest ways to assess the strength is to look at the endowment of the school. Schools that have a strong endowment and are taking a higher percentage of their operating expenses that are coming out of the endowment versus from tuition are schools that are in a stronger position. I was at a meeting last fall where at that time, it was expected that in this one area, there were potentially 1 in 4 small schools could be closing. And so unfortunately, that is something that we could see, given the fact that schools had to give tuition or not, the room and board refunds this year, which hurt some schools financially. It's less students. Some students are not thinking of not going next fall, but then international students are uncertain. And that's where especially a lot of the private colleges balance their budget with international students who are, for the most part, full pay, meaning they're coming and they're not getting any financial aid and they're paying the full amount of the tuition. And so these are all factors that could hurt, unfortunately, some of these great small schools. So you want to make sure that you're assessing the strength of the school before you're making that decision. And that was it, for the presentation. Again, I'll open it up for questions. If anyone has any questions about the admissions process, the selection process, or college financial aid, I would be happy to answer them. If you can't, think of them now and you think of them after, you can email jmaroney@firstchoicecollege.com. On our website, we do have a blog where we put a number of articles, and then we have some different videos, and as well as some podcasts where I've interviewed admissions officers that you can go for those resources. And follow us on Facebook as well, where we update that, or Twitter.